From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. I'm Steve Levingston, nonfiction editor of the Washington Post Book World, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. Tony Horwitz is a man on the move. As a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, he reported from Australia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. And back home, he crisscrossed America, earning himself a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting. Tony not only moves across the globe, he also moves through history. In his book, A Voyage Long and Strange, he went back to early America. In Blue Latitudes, he time traveled to the days of Captain Cook. But there's one historical period that has attracted Tony since he was a boy, and that's the Civil War. He has spent years absorbing the flavor of the era, and several years ago, he produced a remarkable bestseller, Confederates in the Attic. In this book, he joins a band of dedicated reenactors for whom the war still resonates so vividly they dress up in full period costume to relive it. And by digging deep, Tony discovers something beyond the reenactors' obsessions. He comes face to face with the Civil War's persistent, haunting legacy. In his latest book, Midnight Rising, he returns to the Civil War era to recount what he describes as a misguided, wild, and apparently insane act aimed at abolishing slavery. That act was a raid on the Federal Armory at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, in October 1859. Its leader was the fearsome John Brown, who hoped to start a war and arm blacks to fight for their liberation. He failed, but it was just 18 months later that America was torn asunder and Union soldiers marched into battle singing a song called John Brown's Body. As one reviewer has said, Tony Horwitz has given us a hard-driving narrative of one of America's most troubling historical figures. Tony's aim isn't just to paint colorful portraits, but as he says, to show that the Civil War era endures, that it isn't just an adjunct to current events, it's a national treasure of words, images, and landscape. And what separates Tony from other historians is that he gets out and lives history. And through his astute insights and vivid storytelling, he brings history to life for the rest of us. So please join me in welcoming Tony Horwitz.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and to all of you for coming out. I grew up here in Washington and spent last night with my parents, who still live in the house where I grew up. So it's great to come home. And one of the many reasons I'm proud to be a Washingtonian is this is the best book city in America. Nowhere else do you find this concentration of enthusiastic, serious readers. Now, I also know from experience that you ask informed, tough questions, so I will leave as much time as possible for that at the end. Now, we were asked in the little notes we got for this to speak a bit personally, so I thought I'd start by telling the slightly embarrassing story of how this book came about. This is my 6th book, and I've found that book ideas can come from all kinds of places. Lifelong passions, great finds in the archives, bolts of inspiration, serendipitous encounters on the road, or in the case of this book, the nagging of one's spouse. My wife, Geraldine Brooks, writes historical fiction, and she will be speaking later today in the tent for people who make stuff up for a living. A few years ago, she was researching her novel March, which is based on Louisa May Alcott's father. And in researching him, she found that Bronson Alcott had had a lot of contact with a group called the Secret Six. This was this covert cell who were John Brown's innermost core of supporters, funneling him guns and money in the lead up to his raid on Harpers Ferry. And she said to me, in essence, You're a Civil War bore, as she likes to call me. These guys are a great story, and they're not well known. You should write a book about this. And she kept after me for a couple of years while I was doing other things and trying to ignore her, until finally, really to just get Geraldine off my back, I started researching the Secret Six. And Geraldine, as always, was right. They're a great story, these very respectable, prominent New Englanders who conspire with this abolitionist firebrand in this wild scheme to overthrow slavery. But the more I researched them, the more I realized they were really Geraldine's characters, not mine. Any of you who have read her novels know she loves tortured idealists who strive and generally fail to live up to their dreams. And that pretty much describes the Secret Six. These guys, in the end, are not profiles in courage. When their role in John Brown's raid is exposed, most of them flee to Canada, and one of them, Garrett Smith, checks himself into an insane asylum in New York to avoid prosecution, where, by the way, he's treated with morphine and cannabis, and comes out some weeks later declaring that he remembers nothing at all about the events leading up to John Brown's raid, which might well have been the case. Anyway, as I researched these men, I was drawn to the larger story of this raid and John Brown and how this nation came to this moment. Like most Civil War bores, I've always focused on the 1861 to 65 period, the great battles and leaders, and I don't think we often enough step back and ask ourselves, how and why did this conflict come about in the first place? How is it that Americans, who for the most part shared a common language, religion, and culture, came to slaughter each other by the hundreds of thousands in the 1860s? And I think John Brown and his raid and everything that leads to it is really a window into that question. But I was also drawn to this story because of the protagonist, John Brown, who is such a compelling figure, and I think quite different from the way many Americans imagine him. In art and lore and song, if I had a better voice, I would lead John Brown's body. He's typically depicted as this sort of wild-eyed, wild-haired fanatic, possibly insane, with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. But this really isn't true to the historical John Brown, actually beginning with his appearance. For most of his life, he's a clean-shaven, well-groomed American on the make who favors starched white shirts and dark suits and takes business trips to Europe, not your image of a revolutionary. He doesn't grow that famous scary beard of his until the last 18 months of his life, when he's living underground and needs to disguise his identity. He also has really a classically American background, not unlike that of Abraham Lincoln, whose life will ultimately intersect with Brown's. He's born in 1800 to old Yankee farming stock in Connecticut, moves as a boy to what was then the frontier in northeastern Ohio, is educated at a log schoolhouse, goes to work young, and for the first few decades of his life, this future insurrectionist is really something of a conformist. He adopts wholesale his father's strict Calvinist beliefs. He takes on his father's trade of leather tanning, and he marries at his father's prompting to a woman that John Brown describes as remarkably plain, but industrious and economical, of excellent character, earnest piety, and good practical sense. Very romantic words, those. I don't know about the other husbands in the audience, but if I said that about Geraldine, I would be sleeping on the couch for a while. He's also this tremendously ambitious and self-confident man who does things on a big scale throughout his life, beginning with family. He will ultimately father 20 children. Yeah, I complain about 2. And in the entrepreneurial spirit of the age of Jackson, the 1830s, he tries to get rich. He gives up tanning and farming, begins speculating on land, borrowing money to buy property, borrowing more, until this property boom goes bust in the financial panic of 1837, which was a little bit like what we went through in 2008. And Brown, like thousands of other Americans, is driven into bankruptcy. This destitute family also endures repeated tragedies. Brown's first wife dies young in childbirth, as his own mother had done when he was only 8. And of those 20 children he fathers by 2 wives, he will bury 9 of them before they reach the age of 10. Brown battles back from these losses and from bankruptcy in his 40s to become a prominent wool merchant, only to once more overreach and go bust yet again. This is a very talented, driven man, but he is terrible at managing money. So he enters his 50s really as a failure, barely able to support this large family that's been through so much hardship and loss. But this is one of the things I find most remarkable about John Brown. I think most of us would be crushed by those kinds of losses or driven to drink. But he has this burning passion, this unbending conviction that sustains him through his many Job-like trials. He's descended from Puritans, from Revolutionary War officers, and believes that America's founding destiny of liberty and equality can only be fulfilled through the destruction of slavery. And he believes it's his God-given mission to do the job. And he clings to this belief for decades, quietly laying the groundwork until, in his mid-50s, this penniless nobody explodes onto the national scene as the country's leading anti-slavery warrior. Now, there's a lot that's very troubling about Brown. He's really almost an Ahab figure, this obsessive man whose white whale is the destruction of slavery, and he will take everyone down with him if necessary to achieve that. But I have to say, while researching this book and entering my 50s like Brown, I'm very struck by this man's resilience and his capacity to remake himself at what was then considered an advanced age. In his 50s, he's often referred to as the old man or old Brown, and his willingness to take on the great moral issue of his day despite all his worldly troubles. It's a very American story and in some ways an inspiring one. But his militant abolitionism doesn't just spring out of nowhere. Brown is also radicalized by his times. And this was another reason I wanted to write this book, because I think we misunderstand the antebellum era, largely because of Gone with the Wind, the single most influential book ever written on that era. I think many Americans still imagine the pre-Civil War South as a doomed society, clinging to this system of plantation slavery that was destined to be swept away in a modernizing, industrializing world. And because we look back at the Old South through the prism of its defeat in the Civil War, it has this aura of underdog and lost cause. But when you immerse yourself in the letters and diaries and news reports of the pre-Civil War era, when Americans obviously couldn't see the future, things looked altogether different. The South didn't seem an underdog. In many ways, it was the top dog. Politically, the slaveholding South controls the White House, Supreme Court, and many leadership roles in Congress for almost the entire era between the nation's founding and the Civil War. Economically, slave-grown cotton isn't withering away. It is booming, an engine of the national and global economy, by the 1850s accounting for almost 3/4 of the nation's exports, driving northern mills, really, and trade, really the whole country. Cotton is really the oil of its day, this commodity on which everyone is hooked. And slaves themselves are, of course, also a commodity that can be bought and sold. And the value of the South's 4 million slaves was worth more than all the nation's banks, railroads, and industries combined. So let's stop thinking of the South as an underdog. And this not only gives the South, or parts of the South, tremendous wealth and power, but also this great confidence. Even though the North has a bigger population and most of the nation's cities and industries, it's the South that seems the brasher region in this period. As a South Carolina congressman famously boasts in 1858, cotton is king and no one dare defy it. And John Brown does, and that's what ultimately makes him so potent. Most abolitionists, they're a tiny movement, abolitionism, most abolitionists were staunch pacifists. They believed that violence, even in the cause of slaves' liberation, only recapitulated the sins of slave drivers, and that the way to oppose this institution is through education and moral uplift. Brown derides this as what he calls milk and water abolitionism, weak and ineffectual. To him, slavery is a state of war and must be met in kind. And he does so first in Kansas, which in the mid-1850s is the front line in the struggle over whether slavery will extend to new territories. And when Brown arrives there in 1855, as usual with 60 cents to his name, pro-slavery forces really have the upper hand. They're intimidating and sometimes killing northern settlers who want Kansas to enter the Union as a free state. Brown and his sons and his allies start hitting back hard, launching bloody raids, fighting pro-slavery forces in open battle. It's at this point that the territory becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And this really makes Brown a national celebrity. He also crosses into Missouri, a slave state, frees slaves at gunpoint, and escorts them to freedom in Canada. But Brown, as always, is thinking big. He wants to use this new fame he has to launch his big dream, which is to lead a guerrilla army through the mountains into Virginia, largest slaveholding state in the country, seize the federal armory at Harpers Ferry, which has 100,000 guns, free and arm slaves, and begin a really rolling campaign of liberation that's going to topple slavery. And he's going to use his Kansas fame to raise money and guns for this crusade. So he goes east in a sort of full freedom fighter persona and really wows the rather genteel abolitionists of New England who are intoxicated by this rough-hewn frontier warrior. It's a little like the 1960s when you had wealthy New Yorkers hosting Black Panthers. Brown is feted at lecture halls and salons across New England. He dines with Thoreau and Emerson. Another transcendentalist calls him the manliest man I've ever met. A Boston hostess writes about what she calls Brown's moral magnetism, his ability to stir the conscience of wealthy liberals and get them to give to his cause, even though he's very vague about what he intends. And ultimately, he forms this core group of supporters that I made a little fun of at the start, the Secret Six. And they really are a striking group. Two of them are among the wealthiest men of their day, prominent businessmen. The other four are all Harvard men, reformers, intellectuals, ministers. And just as an aside, two of them seem to have had rather difficult marriages. Theodore Parker is one of these men, gave us the great phrase, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. In his private writings, his thoughts weren't always so lofty. In his diary, at one point, he breaks into Greek, and what he had actually written in this code was, "My wife is the devil, and I can't live with it anymore." Another of these men was Samuel Gridley Howe, a prominent Boston doctor and reformer, who was married to Julia Ward Howe, the famous poet who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. In going through her other writings, I found a very depressing couplet she wrote about her wedding, in which she said, "Hope died as I was led unto my marriage bed." Anyway, that's a little bit of what's happening behind the scenes. Geraldine also loves to write about bad husbands, so I don't know whether that was part of her attraction to the Secret Six. That's what's happening behind the scenes. But there are also scores of men who are prepared to fight on the front lines with Brown against slavery. He is not a lone gunman. And the men who join him in Kansas and later Virginia are not suicidal zealots or cult followers. They're really a cross-section of American society at that time. They're factory workers, farmers, artisans, immigrant shopkeepers, bad poets, free blacks, and fugitive slaves who share Brown's burning commitment to taking on slavery, but are otherwise entirely unlike him. None of them share his staunch Calvinist beliefs. They refer to themselves as infidels. And they're young men. Almost all of them are in their early 20s. He's in his late 50s at this point. And like young men of every era, they take risks, they misbehave, and they spend a lot of time courting women. I didn't expect to find a lot of romance in this story, but I was pleasantly surprised. The archives are full of love letters. These guys are risking their lives to free 4 million slaves and save the soul of the nation. And they are working that line hard with the girls. And there were also women in Brown's band. In the summer of 1859, he rents a secluded farmhouse in Maryland, not far from Harpers Ferry, and begins assembling his men and guns for this raid on Harpers Ferry. And he's joined there by his daughter-in-law Martha and his daughter Annie, who are there to act as lookouts and camouflage for this guerrilla band. If passerbys or neighbors become curious about all the comings and goings at this farmhouse, Annie will rush into the yard or to the porch and play the part of ordinary farm woman while the guerrilla fighters huddle out of sight in the farmhouse attic. And I think Annie is really my favorite character in this story. She's a provincial upstate New York farm girl where Brown had settled his family in the Adirondacks, who is suddenly thrown into this great adventure. And she writes these wonderful letters about this exotic southern summer, the fireflies sleeping on a straw mat in this mountain hideout, and the thrill and terror of hiding these dashing young fighters who she calls my invisibles, one of whom becomes her first lover. Another of these men, or people at this farm who fascinates me, is Dangerfield Newby, one of the 5 black men in Brown's band. He's born into slavery in Virginia and is freed in the late 1850s when his owner moves to Ohio, but his wife and children are still in bondage in Virginia, and he is desperate to free them. He works very hard and saves a really extraordinary amount of money for a former slave. He has CDs in Ohio banks so that he can buy his family's freedom. But their owner keeps raising the price and refusing to sell. And this leads to a really wrenching series of letters from Dangerfield's wife, Harriet, who fears she's going to be sold to a gang labor plantation in the Deep South, which was a very common fate for Virginia slaves in this era. And I'll just read you a couple of lines from one of her letters. "Oh, dear Dangerfield, come this fall, without fail, money or no money. If you do not get me, somebody else will, and then all my bright hopes for the future are blasted. If I thought I should never see you again, this earth would have no charms for me. Do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will. Your affectionate wife, Harriet." Dangerfield Newby heeds this plea, goes from Ohio to join Brown's band, and then finally, late one October night in 1859, Brown leads his guerrilla force across the Potomac into Virginia, seizing the armory at Harpers Ferry and sparking a bloody fight. And the first of his men hit is Dangerfield Newby, shot down in the street 50 miles short of his goal of rescuing Harriet, who is then sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. So there's really a great deal at stake, individually and collectively, for all the people caught up in this event. And I'm not going to tell you any more about the raid or the court and prison drama that follow. I want you to read the book. But I will just say a few words about the people on the other side, because this story doesn't just embroil Northern abolitionists. It's really about the South and Virginia in particular, and some rather amazing characters turn up on the other side. During the course of this fight in Harpers Ferry, Brown will ultimately be opposed by U.S. Marines stationed here in Washington, led by a colonel named Robert E. Lee and a lieutenant, Jeb Stuart. Stonewall Jackson will later appear on the scene, though he's not yet known as Stonewall. John Wilkes Booth is present. And meanwhile, here in Washington, Jefferson Davis is leading the charge to investigate this insurrection and bring the perpetrators to justice. So Harpers Ferry is really almost a casting call for the Confederacy 18 months before the Civil War. And you see these soon-to-be famous people in a very different light. And the same is true of Abraham Lincoln, who is also a significant player in this story. John Brown's raid occurs during a presidential election. Lincoln at that point is a second or third tier candidate in the Republican field. And this hit the nation like 9/11, this strike on a symbol of American power. Everybody had to say where they stood on this. And John Brown became really a litmus test of where you stood on slavery. And what's interesting, immersing yourself in Lincoln through this story, is that this man we often think of as the great emancipator was really on the very conservative end of anti-slavery opinion. He criticizes Brown. He says slavery should be left to wither away in the South. That might take a century. That freed blacks should be resettled, really actually deported to Africa or Latin America because they could never live as equals in this country. And I believe that Lincoln's handling of this crisis is crucial to his success winning the Republican nomination and then the election. But what's so striking about Lincoln is that, unlike Brown, whose great strength and weakness is that he never has doubt, he is absolutely staunch in his mission from beginning to end. Lincoln is a man who questions himself, who is willing to compromise, who is willing to adjust his views depending on circumstance. And in the end, in the course of the Civil War, he really comes around to John Brown's view and fulfills Brown's mission with the Emancipation Proclamation and the enlistment of black soldiers. So these two men who really begin at opposite poles ultimately come together and both pay the price. John Brown's hanging and Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, who was also present at Brown's hanging, are really the bookends of our great national bloodletting over slavery. I could prattle on, but since we have a big audience here, I'd really like to use the rest of the time I have to hear from you. So questions, comments, abuse, don't be shy.
How did John Brown verbalize his relationship to God? What did he believe he heard? Did he claim to have dreams and visions from God? And what role was any church playing in his life at the time of the raid?
Good question. And Brown's religiosity is really central to this story. And I think one of the challenges of writing about him as a 21st century person, I wouldn't say he had dreams and visions in that sense, but what's interesting, every one of his letters has a biblical allusion. I had the Bible there while I was researching and writing this book, reacquainting myself with all of it to understand his letters. And what he does is he really cycles through a number of mostly Old Testament figures in the course of his life. At different times he's Job, given all his trials. He's Gideon, blowing the trumpet and punishing the evildoers. He's Moses, liberating the slaves. And in the end, he's Samson, pulling down the pillars of this institution and dying in the ruins. So I would say he sees himself almost living through some of these biblical figures. As a historian I know who says that writing about John Brown is like being trapped in the Old Testament. You want to get out. He is very much, I think, an Old Testament figure and understands himself that way. But he doesn't While he's affiliated with various churches as a younger man, he's someone who always goes his own way, and he actually leaves the church over their treatment of black congregants. Yeah, right here.
Both Robert E. Lee and John Brown, in effect, were committed treason against the United States. But in history, Robert E. Lee is considered by many Americans to be a hero,
right.
And Robert E. Lee and John Brown is considered to be just a loser, right. A traitor.
Yeah.
And why do you think that is?
It's an interesting question. I mean, to me, it's the great irony of this story that you have Robert E. Lee and others, then faithful members of the U.S. Army, fighting and ultimately putting Brown on trial for treason, among other crimes, and saying he was trying to create a breakaway state because he had a constitution, he also had a political manifesto, and then 18 months later, they're doing the same thing. And in fact, one of the first things they do is seize the federal armory at Harpers Ferry to get the guns. So it's weird how this history repeats itself in a different way. John Brown has gone through this fascinating roller coaster in memory where during the Civil War, at least in the North, he's held up as a kind of martyr and hero. Later, he becomes a sort of monster. He's sort of reclaimed in the 1960s. Becomes a hero to Black Panthers, to weathermen, and then in more recent decades has been cited as a model by Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, and anti-abortion bombers. So he has a really kind of complicated legacy, and to me, that's what makes him so fascinating. I don't think you can put him in either of these extreme camps. And that you have to really embrace the complexity and discomfort of this man. He raises really troubling questions. Do the ends ever justify the means? Is violence ever justified in the cause of social justice? And I think my favorite line about him is written by a novelist named Truman Nelson about 50 years ago, and he described John Brown as the stone in the shoe of American history. You know, he's this irritant that we just can never really shake out, who's just, but we can't put him aside either. And I think that's how we have to treat him. Yeah.
Do you know what it was that was the basis of Brown's thought that insurrection would be the route to emancipation? Because in fact, emancipation didn't come through insurrection in this country. Was he influenced by the Caribbean insurrections?
Yeah. Brown was really, I mean, he was largely self-taught. He had very little formal education, but he was a big reader. And in his journals, I mean, he was clearly reading about the Caribbean, Haiti. And while he doesn't talk much about Nat Turner in Virginia, I think he's strongly influenced by this. As many of you know, in 1831, Nat Turner launches a failed slave rebellion. And really, Brown is playing on that deepest fear of Southern whites, that, as happened with Nat Turner, that blacks might rise up and slaughter them in their beds. And I really think he's not exactly modeling himself on Nat Turner, but you know, he really wants to shock the nation. Quite aside from his military ambitions, he's fighting a psychological warfare. Yeah?
Did John Brown's raid make the Civil War inevitable?
Yeah, did John Brown's raid make the Civil War inevitable? That's a really interesting, complicated question, and historians would disagree on this. You know, nothing's ever inevitable, so that's perhaps too strong. But I think at that point, there's really no going back. It really exposes how deep this divide is between North and South. The South at this point really begins mobilizing and arming for secession. And I think Brown's raid and then Lincoln's election are really the 1-2 punch that drive the South out of the nation. But my own answer would be that the Civil War becomes almost inevitable with the Declaration of Independence. You know, when you declare that, you know, all men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, and this is the foundation stone of your society, except that you're excluding 4 million Americans by the time of the Civil War, you know, that this has a long, long lead up. Yeah.
Okay, my question is a little bit broader. I am of the belief that this country is replete with political events in history full of bloodletting. In the Civil War era, it was literally human blood. In today's political situation, it's more multimedia. I was wondering if you could compare and contrast the two and to comment on whether or not this nation has really learned anything.
It's a good question. Yeah, I couldn't help while writing this book, even though I wanted to keep this book in the past. I didn't want to break the spell of what to me is this sweaty, tense narrative. I wanted readers to feel it as Americans did in the 1850s, instead of looking at this with hindsight. But you can't help, as you're researching this kind of thing, not to hear echoes in the present day. One, obviously, with 9/11, but also with the political dialogue. I would not suggest that we are in 1859 now. I don't think we're on the brink of explosive conflict. I hope not. And no issue today has the moral clarity of slavery. But you do sense this, people talking past each other and demonizing each other, that we don't simply disagree with you, you are the Antichrist. And you really see elements in the North and South speaking about each other in that way. And words have consequences. So I think we do have to be careful. But I'm also a little leery of drawing close other parallels. Another one that's sort of interesting, there are all kinds of 9/11 analogies here, right down to the government completely missing warnings that this was about to happen. Brown was not very good at keeping secrets, and there were a lot of people in on this. But also you have to think about the Virginians put him on trial in a civilian court. And in a sense, that turned out to be a mistake for them because he turned it into a pulpit and a press conference. Today, he would have been shuttled off to Guantanamo, and we might never have heard about him again. So it does also force you to think about some of those questions.
Thank you for being here. I was just curious. I've always been moved by John Brown's very powerful speech before his execution. And you talk about the sort of ebb and flow of his personal life in terms of success and failure and the differences in the men around him. In that speech, he says, had I done what I had on behalf of the rich, you would have deemed it all right. I was just curious about John Brown, the class in this actual event. He's always maybe dismissed as a racial slavery issue, but the issue of class.
Issue of class. Well, that's interesting as well. But just first to say about his speech, to me, this is one of many ironies in this story. John Brown, who's this man who's contemptuous of mere speakers and writers and politicians, it's all hot air, action, action, action. Well, he fails. I mean, spoiler alert here, yes. John Brown's raid fails. He's wounded and captured, convicted, and hanged. He fails in his actions, but he ultimately triumphs through the power of his words. And it's really his speeches in court, his letters from prison, and his courage on the gallows that make him a martyr hero to many in the North. And that courtroom speech is just astonishing. He essentially puts the South on trial and says, as you said, that what I did was not wrong but right. And he's speaking, I don't think so much in class terms, but just about the afflicted generally. He says, really, this is what the Bible tells us. The golden rule, and to feel those who are in bonds are bound with us. So I don't think, he did have class consciousness, but I think he's talking in a broader sense about not just class, but race and top dogs and underdogs.
Other than your own book, what recommended reading would you have for someone that's interested in John Brown's life?
I would say go to the archives. The great joy of doing this book, I had done archival research for my other books, but I was always weaving in my contemporary travels. This is the first time I did kind of sustained deep dish archival research for several years at a time. And if there's anyone out there who thinks they want to do that and go to the Library of Congress but feels a little intimidated or something, just go do it. I mean, it's like a treasure hunt. You're just digging through this material, looking for hidden treasure. And it's just, particularly in this era when we're so hooked in electronically, to turn off your cell phone, get handed a pencil, and just lose yourself in another era. And one of the great parts about researching this story is that they were great writers, but that it's very accessible. I did a previous book where I had to read a lot of sources in Latin and French and Spanish. you know, any of us can read a mid-19th century letter, assuming you can read their handwriting, which is often a challenge, and really, you know, begin to grasp it. So I would say, go to the archives, go online. A lot of this has been digitized. It feels like cheating, but you can sit at home and tap into the Kansas archives or the West Virginia archives and read Brown's own words. So I would say, you know, look through the afternotes of my book or any other and go to the original sources.
I was interested in knowing if John Brown had been tried by the federal government instead of the Commonwealth of Virginia, would public opinion have been much different?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, there is a sort of wonderful legal drama here on many levels because Virginia is determined, or particularly the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise, who's sort of a forgotten figure today, but is this immensely important and colorful figure, is determined to have a sort of a show trial, wants to put the whole North on trial and essentially say they're all John Browns. And Buchanan, who's then president and one of our weakest executives, says essentially it's a matter of indifference to me where he's tried, even though this all occurs on federal land. So Virginia takes the lead. I don't know whether federal versus state would have made a difference, but whether it was open in the way it was. Among other things, this occurs at a moment the Telegraph is relatively new. Journalists, you know, this courtroom is packed with journalists. This becomes one of the first breaking news stories in the country. So whether or not it was federal or state, I think it had more to do with what happened in the courtroom and whether he would have been allowed to have that kind of pulpit. I mean, he's just sort of bouncing up during the trial and making these pronouncements. And you get into insanity defense. There are a lot of the lawyers in the audience. It's a really interesting story about a seminal trial in American history.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry.
I've heard that John Brown and Frederick Douglass had an interesting relationship, and I wonder what you found about that in your work.
Yeah, questions about John Brown and Frederick Douglass, who's a major figure in this. This is another way in which Brown is really remarkable for his day. Even anti-slavery Americans are very condescending in their views towards blacks. They think blacks are racially inferior, too docile to fight for their own freedom, sort of leave it to us white folks to sort this out. And Brown says no. He actively recruits black support from Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and others, believes it's a moral and practical imperative that whites and blacks fight together. And he really befriends Douglass. He stays at his home. These men develop a real relationship, which was, you know, very unusual for that day. And Douglass, in the end, doesn't go with him to Harpers Ferry. I think he recognizes it's a suicide mission, but he then becomes really Brown's most eloquent defender, along with Thoreau. I had almost an embarrassment of riches with this book. Everybody had to weigh in on Brown. So you have Frederick Douglass, who I think, along with Lincoln, was our greatest orator of the 19th century. You have Thoreau, Emerson, Melville, you know, the list goes on and on, all these wonderful people. And Douglass really connects Brown, makes you realize how he sort of broke the nation out of this moral numbness, as he calls it, and sort of brings on the great conflict that Douglass and many others felt was necessary to end slavery. So yeah, he's woven all through this story. I'm happy to talk to you individually. I'm around all day, but I think I'm getting the cut signal. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.